So we're moving on now to the context of the organisation, where we're going to cover terms and definitions. So why is it important to have agreed terms and definitions? It's going to improve understanding amongst our staff. It's going to reduce any confusion, and it's going to clarify expectations. It's really important that people understand the information that we're trying to get across to them. And I suppose we've all been there when we've received direction and it wasn't that clear. So it's really important, if we have agreed terms and definitions, that it will assist in organisational efficiency. So what we're going to cover: terms and definition of context. We're going to cover each area where context is referenced within the standard. That's 20 areas. We're going to look at the organisational context, that is the internal context and the external context. We're also going to look at the risk management context, which is different from the organisational context. We're going to look at how the organisational context and the risk management context actually fit together. So, terms and definitions. So the first definition here is actually from the standard. It's clause 451, understanding the organisation and its context. And what this guides us to do is then, when we design the framework, remember we have the principles, we have the framework, and we have the process. When designing the framework, the organisation should examine and understand its external and internal context. That is really important. If we don't understand that, then we won't be able to apply the risk management context to any degree of benefit, assurance. It's going to be ad hoc. We can also look at the definition here that's mentioned within ISO Guide 73209, an old document. What it tells us in there is establishing the context, defining the external and internal parameters to be taken into account when managing risk, and setting the scope and risk criteria for the risk management policy. So both standards there are telling us how important it is with regards to the framework, because we are defining those parameters. And there I've just added some context screenshot from a dictionary definition. What does this tell us? The circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood. So basically it is the situation. The context refers to the situation, whether that's internal, external, or the situation where we're going to undertake risk management, which is the risk management context. When we look at the standard here, we can see top right that it highlights 30 times the word context is highlighted. Actually, for relevance, the relevant times it appears within the standard is actually 20 times, which we're going to go through. So the first time it's mentioned is in the introduction. Managing risk considers the external and internal context of the organisation, including human behaviour and cultural factors. So straight away, it's making that alignment between the contexts and the ability to manage risk. It's then referenced in the scope. This document provides guidelines on managing risk faced by organisations. The applications of these guidelines can be customised to any organisation and its context. So slightly, I nearly said out of context, but just taking it external and more sort of a deriver for the actual standard. The standard can be used in any organisations and applied to the context within those organisations. 3, we got principles, and this part of the principles is customised. There's 8 principles, but when we look at customisation, the risk management framework and process are customised and proportionate to the organisation's external and internal context. So this is referencing the frameworks. We must apply that framework based on the situation, like we said just now, the situation, which is the context, internal and external. The 4th time it's mentioned is again in principles, with reference to being dynamic. Risks can emerge, change, or disappear as an organisation's external and internal context changes. We will look at what makes up the internal and external context, but ultimately what it's saying here, risks can emerge. That is, opportunities and threats when that context changes. Risk management anticipates, detects, acknowledges, and responds to those changes and events in an appropriate and timely manner. The area to focus on here is the actual context. That is linking a change in external or internal context to a change in risks, again, opportunities or threats. So that's that dynamic. Risk management must be dynamic. The fifth time is in leadership and commitment. Leaders must ensure that the risk management framework remains appropriate to the context of the organisation. Again, we have the framework in one hand, referencing the context and making sure they have to align. When we put the risk management framework in, we must review the context of the organisation, the internal context and the external context, to ensure that we apply the framework at appropriate functions and activities. Another one for leadership and commitment. Leaders must ensure that such risks are appropriate in the context of the organisation's objectives. So now we're using context when we're talking about objectives. Our objectives are set within the external context of the organisation. That's where we're trying to go. So we must make sure that the risk management process is appropriate. It can't be too much, it can't be too little, it must be tailored, it must be dynamic, which is one of the principles. Integration. Integrating risk management relies on an understanding of organisational structures and context. This is the seventh time this is mentioned, and you can see it's very, very similar how every time it gets mentioned are very similar. It's about the framework. It's about applying risk management to the context. It is really important that we understand it. 8. When we are designing the framework for managing risk, the organisation should examine and understand its external and internal context. There we go. Again, it is categorically linked to the framework and to managing risk, so the risk management process. Another one for design. Examining the organisation's external context may include, but is not limited to, and then it gives us a list which we will cover. Same for examining the organisation's internal context, is not limited to. We shall have a look at that in the next couple of slides. But here we can see there's 3 there on design, and it's all about designing the framework. Now we're going into the process. So the risk management process, which is 6 steps. This is part of one of those steps, establishing the context. The risk management process involves the systematic application of policies, procedures and practices to the activities of communicating and consulting, establishing the context and assessing. It goes on to mention the 6 elements of the risk management process. If we don't establish the context, again the external and the internal, then we can't develop the risk management context, or we could say the risk management methodology. So again, it features there in the design, and now we're starting to feature within the process. Process again. There can be many applications of the risk management process. This is the 6 steps within an organisation, customised to achieve objectives, one of the principles, and to suit the external and internal context in which they are applied. What's getting said here is risk management can apply at many areas. We can apply it strategic, tactical, operational, project, program, objective, task. We can apply it in so many areas, but it's all about context under consideration. Process again, this time 13, 14 and 15 times it's been mentioned. The purpose of establishing the scope, the context and the criteria is to customise the risk management process. We've already mentioned this. Enabling effective risk assessment and appropriate risk treatment. Scope, context and criteria involve defining the scope of the process and understanding the external and internal context. We're now up to 15 times this has been mentioned. Think about it. Internal context, external context. Work out what those are. Then we can apply the risk management framework, or we can build a risk management framework based on the understanding of that context. If we're in the maritime security industry, the context is going to be different to land security, which is going to be different to an engineering environment. So the context is key. We've got to understand that. Another tool for the process. The external and internal context is the environment in which the organisation seeks to define and achieve its objectives. We've already said that. It's all about the external and the internal context. If we think about the external, the things that goes on outside the organisation, that's where we are seeking to make our money. That's where we are setting our objectives. That's what the organisation is all about. It's within that external environment. The context of the risk management process should be established from the understanding of the external and internal environment, we could say context there, in which the organisation operates, and should reflect the specific environment of the activity to which the risk management process is to be applied. That second paragraph is a really important paragraph. If you can understand what that paragraph is telling us, you will understand internal, external, and the risk management context, and you will actually be able to separate all three. That's 16 and 17, that's an important one there. 18 and 19. Understanding the context is important because risk management takes place in the context of the objectives and activities of the organisation. Again, it's relating risk management, doing risk management, following the risk management process, the 6 steps, and it's telling us that that takes place where the organisation is trying to achieve its objectives. That is generally outside of the organisation. However, the internal context, people, processes, vision, values, structure, X, Y, and Z, that is going to impact how well we do risk management. So therefore, it is critical that we understand our internal context, because they are sources of risk as well. As it says there, organisational factors can be a source of risk, definitely are a source of risk, because it's either opportunities or threats. And number 20, the organisation should establish the external and internal context of the risk management process by considering the factors mentioned in 541. So what do we mean by that? Let's have a quick look at what 541 is. Understanding the organisation and its context. So we have to look at the external context, the internal context. We've got to understand that as a whole in order to apply the right risk management methodology. Really important. What we've noted there, we've talked about the organisational context, the first context, but also, which is made up of the internal and external, but also the risk management context. Another way of thinking about the risk management context is the risk management methodology. What tools, what techniques, how we're going to apply it. And that will be different dependent on the activities we're doing. Really important. So as we can see there, the first mentioning the context of the risk management process should be established from the understanding of the external and internal environment. The context of the risk management process. And here we have the risk management takes place in the context of the objective. So again, so you can see that separation of the two, and you can see the reference to the two. The organisation established internal context of the risk management process by understanding its external and internal context. Hopefully this is really simple. We can see that's 20 times this has been mentioned. It's really, really important. Okay, moving on. Still on and sticking with terms and definitions, it's all about context, as we know. Organisational context, internal and external. So what type of things are we considering? So if we take a normal organisation, I've chose PCR Global here. This is not going to be specific to our organisation, but this is there to give you a visual representation of what we actually mean by the internal context. So the internal context is in which is the environment in which the organisation seeks to achieve its objectives. This is the internal context. Within the internal context, we have a number of items. Again, this is not it's not exhaustive. There's going to be more than this. It is dependent on the organisation, but for definite vision, mission and values, that is reliant on the organisation setting those. Other items that's reliant on the organisation is the organisational structure. That's going to be specific to the company as are the roles and the accountabilities within the organisation. Company strategy, company objectives, and the company culture. Again, this is all internal. It will impact how we do our jobs, how we appreciate risk, how we appreciate health and safety, environment, corporate social responsibility. This is all internal. It is part of the internal context. Policy, standards and guidelines. Capabilities of resources, for definite. We need to train people within inside the organisation to understand risk management, what to do. It needs to affect the decision making. Relationships, perceptions, values, needs and expectations of stakeholders. What do our employees think of us? All of this is internal. Contractual relationships and commitments. These could be contracts internally. And what internal commitments do we have? And then finally, for 8, we have interdependencies and interconnections within the organisation. How are various departments working together? How are various business units? These could be global, these could be regional, it could be one very small organisation. Remembering that this fits all organisations. But there we have 8 areas that the standards guides us to being part of the internal context. So the internal context, as it says, is the internal environment in which the organisation seeks to achieve its objectives. Now we're going to look at the external context. Very similar to the internal, the external environment in which the organisation seeks to achieve its objectives. Hopefully by now you can see that when we're thinking about the organisational context, in white we have internal, orange we have external. These are the things that's external. So we could think of those as, we could use the mnemonic PESTLE: political, economical, social, technical, legal and environmental, on an international scale, but also on a regional scale as well. So PESTLE, when we look at that, we could do a PESTLE assessment, can't we? A PESTLE analysis, as it's called. We could look at the political, economical, social, technical, legal, environmental factors that are impacting our objectives. Remember, risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives, and surely there's a lot of uncertainty that is exterior to the organisation. They're going to impact the organisation. They change. Second, there we have the complexity of networks and dependencies. PCR Global as an organisation, we have a lot of dependencies outside, whether that's the awarding bodies for our courses or the organisations that we actually work with as well that enable us to make money. And there we have it, contractual commitments. What have we committed to, and what have people committed to us? Relationships, perceptions, values, then the needs and expectations of, again, anybody in the external environment. Needs and expectations, we could be looking at the law, the governance, external law, statutory requirements. They expect us to operate in a certain way. And what are the sort of key drivers that are impacting our objectives? What is going on externally that is going to affect us from achieving our objectives, which is, as an organisation, making money, of course. Achieving what we're set us to do, but we need to make money to stay afloat, of course. So there we can see there, in the white we have the internal environment, orange we have the external environment, and that is the organisational context. But thinking back to the slides earlier, we also talked about the risk management context. So we have the process, where this was referenced earlier on, part of the process. We have the risk management context. The organisation should establish the external and internal context of the risk management process by considering the factors mentioned in 5.4.1. So this was number 20, the 20th time of relevance it was mentioned. But what the risk management context must do is take into consideration both the external context and the internal context. It's quite a busy slide, but for me personally, I'm quite visual. That really does, when I look at that, it really does help me understand what we're meaning by the 3 types of context. So, what must we know? Well, we must know there are two contexts to consider. That is the internal and the external context, but also the risk management context. As we've just discussed, this will determine our risk assessment methodology and the risk management process methodology as well. And when building the framework for managing risk, we must understand the internal and external context of the organisation. And why? Because this is where the organisation has its objectives set. This is where we're operating. And the internal context is a source of risk. Remember, we looked at structure, vision, mission, values, roles, responsibilities, ownerships. If we have training, if we haven't set that up internally correctly, then we are going to struggle to apply positive risk management. So that's it. We covered organisational context there, and we looked a lot at clause 3, which is terms and definitions within the standard. So thank you very much, and look forward to the next module.